Today I got for you the ultimate Battlefield RedSec performance optimization guide. In this video I will show you the best windows and config settings to boost FPS inside of the new Battlefield Battle Royale RedSec, as well as the best graphics settings to improve visibility and performance. For this I have jumped into Battle Royale with a second system about 1000 times, got shot in the face roughly equally many times, in order to bring you guys the actual performance impact inside of the Battle Royale mode, together with side-by-side comparisons of every graphics setting. Beginning with ReBar or Resizable Base Address Register, we have already seen for the multiplayer segment that this had quite a significant positive impact on performance in Battlefield 6. This also holds true for RedSec, where I'm getting roughly 25 FPS more or 11% more performance when enabling ReBar. If you don't know what ReBar is or how to enable it, check out the linked video in the card right now. Now when I talk about ReBar, we have to talk about drivers a little bit, because with the latest NVIDIA driver 581.57, Battlefield 6 is whitelisted to support ReBar out of the box. So for the best performance inside of RedSec, you'll want to use the latest NVIDIA driver. On the AMD side of things, there is now a driver 2510.2, which has official support for Battlefield 6. As for game mode, I didn't observe this to have a massive positive impact on performance inside of RedSec, similar to the multiplayer portion of Battlefield 6. On the other hand, hardware accelerated GPU scheduling, or HAGS, has a significant positive impact on performance, especially on my GPU-bound system. Just be aware that if you are super CPU bound, enabling this option might reduce performance inside of RedSec, so if you're also stuttering and your CPU is always packed at around 90%, then try to disable this option. Besides Windows settings, we can also boost performance inside of RedSec through a few configuration tweaks. For this, you want to find out where Battlefield 6 is installed, so in Steam, right-click on the game, click on Manage, go to Browse Local Files, add a text file and call it user.cfg. Make sure to remove the txt. And here we can add a few config tweaks. The first of which is to disable the transparency shadow maps. This has no effect on the visual quality of the game while giving you a couple of FPS more performance. Next we have this LightTileCsPath, which essentially disables all dynamic lights. This does boost performance quite significantly, so if you are struggling with performance, this is the one config tweak that can really give you a lot of performance. However, you have to be careful, because whenever you disable this, then of course your flashlight will no longer work. All of the interior spaces look very flat and very poorly lit, and both the lobby and infill sequence look a bit funny. So I would only recommend to disable this if you're really struggling for performance and you're trying to just make the game playable, then sure, you can disable this at a significant loss of visual fidelity. Finally, there still appears to be some motion blur effect applied to the game, even when we disable the weapon and world motion blur, and with this we can again gain a few FPS. Other than that, I haven't found the other very popular configuration tweaks that are floating around the internet to positively affect performance or actually reduce CPU usage. I did a bunch of in-depth testing with thread processor counts, but this config value does not seem to have an effect on my two systems that I tested this on at all. And the final thing that you want to modify outside of the game is to disable the weapon DOF. I'm still a bit surprised that there is no in-game toggle for this, so you'll have to go to Documents, Battlefield 6, Settings, then click on Steam or EA depending on where you have the game installed, and open the profsave_profile file. Look for weapon DOF and set this from 1 to 0. Once in game, let's open up the settings, go to Graphics, and click on Graphics Quality Settings. Beginning with texture quality, we can see that this option has no effect on performance, as this simply modifies the resolution of textures in-game. Between low and high, we can see quite a lot of surfaces where this has quite a significant impact on the visual fidelity of the game. However, when going from high to ultra or even from ultra to overkill, the differences become negligible. The difference between low and high is also quite noticeable on our guns, and also loot boxes look quite pixelated with the low preset. Next, let's look at memory usage. As you can see, the difference is largest when going from low to high, where I'm using up to 1.4 GB more VRAM, whereas the step to Ultra and Overkill doesn't put that much additional textures into our memory. as I would argue that the visual difference between high and overkill is negligible, and because I've heard a lot of people actually struggling with overkill that they would run into performance issues when playing for a while, I would highly recommend the high preset for anyone with 8 or more gigabytes of VRAM. If you have less than that, then I'm afraid you'll have to stick to low. Unsurprisingly, texture filtering also does not affect performance inside of RedSec, as this only improves the visual quality of textures that are viewed at a very shallow angle. As always, I would recommend to set texture filtering, or anisotropic filtering as it's called in other games, to the overkill preset, as it significantly improves the visual fidelity of the game. Mesh quality, on the other hand, does have a significant negative impact on performance, where I'm seeing a reduction in performance of up to 10% by going from low to overkill. Visually, this simply improves the LOD, or level of detail, of different objects, or even if the object is even rendered at a certain distance. On the plus side, setting mesh quality to a high level allows you to see windows of buildings that are very far away. But on the negative side, mesh quality also significantly increases the complexity of vegetation in the world. In some cases, like for this hatch, we can see that with low mesh quality, the hatch is just completely gone, and you can actually see right through it, so somebody hiding behind this hatch is going to have a very bad time. On the other hand, player characters don't seem to be affected by mesh quality, so even with mesh quality on low, you should always see all enemies regardless. So for all of these reasons, I would actually recommend to set mesh quality to low, or at least to medium, for better visibility in RedSec. Terrain quality only insignificantly reduces performance and only affects the depth of certain parts of the map, giving ground textures a little bit more bumpiness and a bit more shadows between rocks. I haven't really found any spot where setting this too low or ultra gave you an advantage, so set it to whatever you like. While Undergrowth Quality didn't measurably affect performance inside of the multiplayer portion of Battlefield 6, this is no longer the case for Fort Linden, where I'm actually measuring a significant reduction in performance when increasing this setting. Visually, it increases the number and quality of shrubs on the ground, making enemy players hiding in them much harder to spot. Because this setting comes with quite a significant reduction in performance, and because it makes visibility worse, I would recommend to leave this on low. Effects quality only reduces performance by a couple of FPS and increases the number of spark effects that we can see on certain assets in the game. This is most noticeable inside of the Firestorm, where we have these exploding effects that emit a lot more particles. On the other hand, when looking at a collapsing building, I can't see a difference in terms of the smoke effects between low and high. Volumetric quality reduces performance by 2 to 4%, and visually we can see that on the low preset, these kind of god rays inside of buildings are a bit brighter and a bit more annoying. However, the improvement in visual fidelity is definitely not worth the reduction in performance. Lighting quality, on the other hand, has no effect on performance and is a super important setting to actually enable. From this comparison, you can see that certain areas on the map are completely dark when setting lighting quality to low, making visibility in them an absolute nightmare. So if you ever encountered rooms that seem to be very poorly lit, then try to enable the lighting quality setting and see if that helps. Local lights and shadow quality only reduces performance by a couple of FPS and increases the number of dynamic lights in the scene. Besides the dynamic lights, we can also see a lot more shadows being introduced when setting local lights and shadow quality to high or overkill. On the other hand, it no longer appears that this setting negatively affects the shadows that are cast by dynamic lights, so as you can see from this comparison, my shadow is visible even with having local light and shadow quality set to low. Now, because there aren't that many dynamic lights inside of the Battle Royale map, this setting likely doesn't have such a huge performance impact, so for a bit more visual fidelity you set it to high, and for more performance leave it on low. For shadows, we have the option between PCF and PCSS filtered shadows. Using the first filter, going from low to medium only reduces performance by 4 FPS, 9 FPS going to high, and then the performance reductions become kind of ridiculous between ultra and overkill. Visually, I would argue that low simply looks horrible because you have all of these pixelated shadows that are kind of dancing around on the floor and are super distracting. Selecting a higher preset then simply increases the distance at which a higher shadow resolution map is drawn on the ground. The PCSS filtered shadows come with an even higher reduction in performance, with already 8 FPS reduction on medium and 35 FPS on the overkill preset. On low, both of these filters produce the exact same shadows, And above that, we can see that the PCSS filtered shadows are a bit more diffuse and a bit more realistic. Note that this diffusion filter is only visible up until to a certain distance, where shadows look pretty much identical to PCF. My recommendation would be to set the shadow quality setting to medium using the PCF filter, and if you have a bit performance to spare, then set shadow quality to high. Reflection quality doesn't significantly reduce performance, which is quite different from the multiplayer segment, where I saw quite significant reductions in performance when increasing this setting. This is probably due to the fact that there are not that many windows on the map, and yes, obviously I tested that in a spot that had a lot of glass. Clearly, this setting improves the quality of reflections, and whether you like this setting at low or high comes down to personal preference. I personally prefer the more smeared out looking reflections over the more pixelated ones that you get with the high preset. Screen space reflection, on the other hand, have a humongous effect on performance inside of RedSec, and I would highly recommend you to turn off this setting, because all it does is make reflections on watery surface more realistic, but due to its large negative impact on performance, and since there aren't even that many water bodies on the map, I would recommend to leave them disabled. Ambient occlusion and global illumination expectedly reduces performance quite significantly, at least on a GPU-bound system. On the other hand, if you're more CPU-bound, this setting likely doesn't have that much of a significant impact on your performance. As always, this adds shadows around objects and make them look more grounded in the scene. From a visual standpoint, I can see that this makes sense to enable, however, because it comes at such a huge performance impact, and since you usually don't even notice that ambient occlusion is disabled, my recommendation is to turn this off. And finally, we have the high fidelity objects amount, which is a setting that kept me busy for quite some time, because no matter where I looked, I didn't find a visual example of this setting actually affecting the fluidity of animations of players or of vehicles inside of the Battle Royale. So for that reason, I believe that this is a purely single player based setting, but since it doesn't affect performance, you might as well stick it to Ultra just in case. Under advanced graphic settings, the first thing that I tested was to enable a frame rate limiter in-game, and from this you can see that I set it to 240 FPS with the goal to improve latency and frame time stability. Unfortunately, the in-game limiter doesn't seem to be positively affecting the overall system latency, and also the frame time graph didn't look that stable even with a capped frame rate. The same also holds true when capping your frame rate using the NVIDIA app. Also, NVIDIA Reflex low latency still seems to be bugged because I'm getting exactly the same latency figures with this disabled, enabled or enabled plus boost. NVIDIA is already aware of the issue and is hopefully able to fix this in an upcoming driver release. Now, with the game's native rendering being extremely pixelated, it's almost mandatory to use some sort of anti-aliasing or upscaling technique inside of RedSec. XESS and DLAA have roughly the same performance impact at about 17%, followed by FSR at 12% and TAA at 8%. Unfortunately, TAA looks absolutely horrible as soon as we start moving, so that one is definitely already out of the picture. Note that I am able to use DLSS version 4 that has the nice new transformer model for these comparisons, as I own a 4000 series NVIDIA GPU. If you have an older GPU like a 3000 series or 2000 series, you can only use DLSS 3, and if you have yet an older GPU, then unfortunately you won't be able to use DLAA or DLSS altogether. Also, I'm only able to show you comparisons with FSR 3 because I don't own a 9000 series AMD GPU. Comparing the visual quality of all upscalers, we can see that DLAA is clearly the sharpest, followed by XESS. Of course, if I had access to FSR4, that might look somewhat similar. In this example here, TAA is absolutely unusable, with the fence becoming a blurry mess, whereas the other upscalers do a much better job. Again, I would argue that DLAA comes out on top. However, I'd argue that using one of the upscaling techniques is the better solution to anti-aliasing, as this also will boost your performance quite significantly. DLSS4 Ultra Performance boosted my performance 63%, 43% on performance mode, 32% on balanced, and finally still a very good 22% on quality. Visually, Ultra Performance is absolutely unusable. It has an insane amount of fringing, which is still somewhat visible on the performance preset. Balanced already looks much better, has almost no fringing, but is still not quite as sharp when compared directly to DLAA. On the other hand, when we directly compare DLSS quality with DLAA, which has a difference in performance of over 70 FPS, I could literally not tell if I didn't label this footage which comes from DLAA and which is from DLSS quality. So in my opinion, if you have a 4 or 5000 series NVIDIA GPU, definitely use DLSS quality for the best performance and visual quality. As for FSR 3.0, I'm getting even higher boosts in performance inside of RedSec, and visually once again ultra performance is basically unusable, and so is performance. Balanced starts to look a bit more sharp and a bit more refined. However, if you do also have only a 7000 series AMD GPU, I would recommend the quality preset. Finally, XESS is a bit in between DLSS and FSR in terms of performance, with boosts of up to 60% on the ultra performance mode. Visually, this, in my opinion, looks a bit better than FSR, and I would argue that the balanced mode already is much more usable, as this already doesn't have that much fringing. On the very difficult example with the fence again though, the quality preset is the only one that is somewhat stable. Finally, here I'm comparing the native upscaling with the quality preset of each upscaler, and for one we can see that all of the upscalers struggle to resolve these fine details of the chain link fence, and while FSR and DLSS quality look pretty comparable, XESS definitely falls off, not just in terms of resolution, but also in terms of looking very washed out. And because this scene is so much fun, let's also look at it through the different upscalers. So here we have DLSS, FSR and XESS, each with its 4 presets. Here it's quite striking how bad XESS looks compared to DLSS and FSR, and even though we have FSR 3, I would actually say that it is very comparable or even on par with DLSS. Now, as I mentioned in my video covering the multiplayer segment of Battlefield 6, I did notice that with the more CPU-bound system, these upscalers wouldn't really provide that much of a performance gain. In fact, I would pretty much observe the same performance as without any upscaling. However, even with a very CPU-bound system, it does make sense to use upscaling, as you'll essentially get anti-aliasing at no performance penalty. NVIDIA frame generation does boost performance, however it does so by inserting AI frames in between actual rendered frames from your GPU, and therefore this technology always have to wait for 2 frames to be rendered before it can actually place a 3rd frame in between. So no matter how high your base performance is, this approach will always introduce additional latency, so in any case I would recommend to turn this feature off. And finally, future frame rendering only insignificantly affects performance while ever so slightly increasing latency. I haven't found this option to make gameplay smoother, which is why I recommend to turn it off. Moving on to the camera settings, where we first have the field of view. Now, contrary to popular belief, having a high field of view does not net you lower performance. This hasn't been the case for very long, and a very quick test reveals that this is also true for RedSec, where I'm getting actually the lowest performance when setting field of view to a value of 90 degrees. So set this up however you like, but I personally like to play at a field of view of 110 degrees. The vehicle third-person field of view I like to crank all the way to the maximum to see more of your surroundings. Weapon field of view set to wide in order to make the weapon as small as possible so you won't accidentally cover any enemy players. Weapon and world motion blur you want to set to 0, set the camera shake amount to the lowest value of 50 and turn on reduce sprint camera bobbing. Finally, we have chromatic aberration, vignette and film grain, which are all post-processing effects. Especially chromatic aberration does in fact reduce performance ever so slightly, and I personally like to play with those off, but obviously whether you like the more cinematic look with those turned on comes down to personal preference. As full screen mode, you can select borderless, as this provides the highest performance and lowest latency. Select the highest full screen resolution, so that's your native monitor's resolution, and keep aspect ratio on auto. VSync is only relevant if you get any screen tearing, which I guess is only relevant if you have a very low refresh rate monitor, but just be aware that enabling this option does increase your overall system latency. Finally, if you go over to hot, you can enable the SOVIS Filter, which is super clutch, as you will see enemy players much more easily as they have kind of this sort of halo effect around them, which is especially noticeable in a dark environment. And that's it. On screen you can now see my best recommended settings for the highest performance and best visibility in Battlefield RedSec. I really hope this video was helpful, and if that's the case, then leave a like and drop a comment down below to help me fight the algorithm against all of the other clickbait YouTubers. Also, if you want to get better at RedSec and even get your first win, then here are a few very important tips about tick rates, about custom loadouts, and also about timings of different events in-game that many other YouTubers really don't cover, and I'd really hope that this video can also help you get better at RedSec. But that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.